version of the Bible this is?
King James Version. All right.
Say it louder, please.
King James Version.
King James Version. You guys you all are young enough that you did not have a grandmother like I did. My grandmother lived in a little town called Sterling, Kansas. The big church in the mid. If you took a dart and threw it smack dab at the center of the country, you would hit little old Sterling, Kansas, about 2,000 people. But Sterling, Kansas had a college. It was a Presbyterian college called Sterling College, still there, still graduates people. And they also had a big United Presbyterian church. In the year that I was born, up until 1953, all of our churches used the King James Version of the Bible. And in 1953, the powers that be went back, did a new version and a new translation of the Bible called the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And my grandmother thought that the people that did the Revised Version of the Bible were Satan incarnate. There was no way in the world that she was ever going to have a Revised Standard Version of the Bible in her house, because the King James Version of the Bible, I'm sure that as far as she was concerned, that God personally dictated the words of the King James Version of the Bible. If my grandmother had had any understanding of how the King James Bible had come to be written, she probably would have been a lot more generous toward the people who put together the Revised Standard Version. So we're going to take about a step back in time, about 400 years. Actually, in 2011, the King James Version of the Bible celebrated its 400th anniversary. That's the year that it was published. But I want you, hey, come on in and have a seat, and we are happy to have you with us. Pastor Hanson and he and I are swapping pulpits this morning. So if you want to hear a good sermon, come back next Sunday also. Okay. So, all right. So, take a step back from 1611. Go back to 1603. Queen Elizabeth I, she's the one with the very white face and the red hair, the one they called Virgin Queen. She had just died, and her successor, not a direct successor, but son of a cousin or a sister or something like that, King James, James of Scotland, is moving from Scotland, taking a long trip from Scotland down to London. And on the way down there, he is, and some things never change, he is worrying and concerned about what to do about a divided country. And his country was really seriously divided, because it was divided between the Puritans, Protestants, or, as they were called back then in a very pejorative way, Presbyterians, and the Anglicans. And the Anglicans, King James had more of an affinity to the Anglicans than he did to the Presbyterians, and I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. So on his way on this trip down from Edinburgh to London, there's 1,000 Puritan ministers had signed a petition. And the petition didn't ask for a whole lot, but what it was trying to do, the Anglican Church had already split from the Roman Church, because Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, wanted to have all those wives, and actually what he wanted was a male heir. But anyway, so the church had already split once, but it still was very, very Catholic in what it was doing. The Puritans wanted to stop a couple of things. They wanted to stop baptism by midwives, because they didn't think children, if a child was born and it wasn't going to thrive, a child didn't have to be baptized in order to go to heaven. God was going to let that newborn baby into heaven no matter what. They wanted to stop using the sign of the cross, They wanted to stop bowing at the name of Jesus. They wanted to stop wearing vestments. Believe it or not, your traditional Presbyterian robes are lawyers' robes. That would have been the common wear of the day. And they also, and boy, this was the big one, they asked the king to ditch bishops and to set up presbyteries. Now, we Presbyterians have got quite the revolutionary background. And even in the American Revolutionary War, King George referred to the American Revolutionary War not as the Revolutionary War, but as that Presbyterian rebellion. So, after James gets down to London, about a year later, he calls a conference because, again, his goal is to unite his country. He wants to unite the Puritans and the Anglicans. And the Puritans were outnumbered about 4-1. And James spent most of his time with the Anglican bishops. And when the Puritans asked for presbyteries, he shouted, "No bishop, no king." You see, the problem with presbyteries is that Presbyterianism is a representative form of government. The people elect the people that are going to govern them. Bishops get assigned by the Pope or by whoever the head of the Anglican Church is. So James understood that if he had presbyteries, the next step would be to ditch the king. And needless to say, he didn't want that. So, at the conference, he threw the Puritans a couple of bones, changed a little bit of the language in the Common Prayer Book. But then he made a decision to do something that neither the Anglicans nor the Puritans wanted to do. And that was, he decided he wanted to come up with a new translation of the Bible. You can imagine the folks at that conference, their jaws just dropped. What? Translate a new translation of the Bible? So, it would behoove us at this time, and that's one of the reasons why we've been using all this "thee and thy" language in the service this morning. It would behoove us this morning to consider how the King James Bible came to be today, why it is still so influential. Because it arose out of the conflicts of the Reformation. And a lot of what happened with the King James Bible then has influenced what's happened in our lives in the years after that. So, as I mentioned with the children, people were starting to push back against the Roman and Latin way of doing worship. They wanted worship in the language of the people. Gutenberg, about 100 years earlier, had invented the printing press, and so people were starting to, up until that time, you guys all learned this in history class, you had to handwrite all the books. They were big, they were heavy, they were massively expensive. But with the printing press, all of a sudden, books were being able to get out into the hands of the people. And what better book to use to teach people to read than the Bible? At least, every house should have, if you're going to have one book in the house, have a Bible, right? So, about this time, this is before King James's time, there was a wonderful biblical scholar named William Tyndale. And he had already started translating the Bible into the language of the people. Martin Luther himself did it. John Calvin. They all started doing translations in the language of the people. But they were over in Geneva and in Switzerland, which was much more open to this stuff. Back in England, that was another story. So, at the time that the King James scholars got together to start working on their translation, there were 4 Bibles. And I'm going to come back to these 4 Bibles in a moment, because what you need to understand is this. Tyndale, as I said, was an excellent, excellent scholar. But he couldn't go back to England because his life would have been endangered. But he got betrayed by somebody. He got arrested, and here's what ended up happening to him. He was strangled and then burned at the stake. And his last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Now, Henry VIII was king at this time. And about 4 years after Tyndale's death, Henry VIII and Britain did start doing some translations of the Bible in the vernacular. The problem was only one of these 4 was really any good. The first version was called the Great Bible. It was required in the churches. It was big, it was expensive, and it was so expensive that you had to chain it to the lectern in case somebody came in and wanted to steal it. So that was the Great Bible. The second Bible was what's called the Bishop's Bible. And that was the Bible that the Anglicans used during Queen Elizabeth's time. And it was not a great Bible. It didn't translate from the original languages. Instead, what they did was they took the Latin versions of the Bible and then they translated from those Latin versions. And it actually acquired the nickname of the treacle Bible. Y'all know what treacle is, right? It's that kind of gooey, fatty residue that's left after you cook meat or something like that. And the reason it's called the treacle Bible is because in Jeremiah 8:22, instead of the words, "Isn't there any balm in Gilead?" it's, "Is there not treacle in Gilead?" How many of you guys have sung the hymn, "There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sick soul"? Okay, so that was translated treacle in that Bible. Then Ecclesiastes 11:11 was translated as "Lay thy bread upon wet faces." Lay thy bread upon wet faces. Whereas Tyndale translated as "cast thy bread upon the waters." So a lot of these phrases that are familiar to us, the treacle Bible, sounded terrible. So King James says, okay, I want to get these scholars together and I want you guys to work on this new translation. Oh, sorry, and there was another Bible that was a very good translation, but it was also a revolutionary translation, and that was called the Geneva Bible, and it was produced in Geneva, Switzerland by the English exiles. It was small, it was portable, it was the first Bible to have chapter and verse numbers in it, so people could figure out where to find stuff in it. It used a lot of Tyndale's translations. It was the Bible when the first Europeans came to America, the Puritans and those folks. That was the Bible that they brought with them when they came to this country. It was also the Bible that if you're a Shakespeare scholar and you see he uses a lot of biblical verses in his works, this is the Bible that he used. It was an excellent translation from the original languages. It had great margin notes, but King James had a problem with it because every time that Bible referred to every time the Latin Bible, let me backtrack just a moment. There's a word for elder, presbyteros. And I know we got a room full of elders in here, okay? So the word for elder that we use all the time, in that Bible was also translated elder, but in the other versions, the word was translated bishop. King James wanted bishops. You have to remember, he wanted bishops. The other problem with the Geneva Bible was that that it translated the word king as tyrant. Imagine reading your Bible and reading about King David, only it comes up as tyrant David. And imagine if you're King James, and every time you're reading the Bible, it comes up as tyrant. So that's one of the reasons why this very good translation, popular translation, James wanted to do something else. So they started working. And one of the things they made up, they were very Presbyterian actually in the way they organized themselves, because they made up committees. So they went to Oxford, Cambridge, and a couple of other places. They started working on their sections of the Bible. And then they got back together, and then they did something, and this is one of the things that's critical to the beauty of the King James Version. Then they all sat down and they read the Bible to one another. And out of that reading, the King James Bible really is more for a Bible for the ear than it is a Bible for the eye. Now, there are a couple of things to note about this wonderful book right here. The first one was that they used literal translations, and they used a ton of Tyndale's work. They wanted it to be as literal as possible. So Tyndale, when he wrote about the wise men seeing the star, he said they were marvelously glad. And in the King James, which is closer to the original Greek, it said they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. You hear there's a little redundancy in there, but that's also closer to the original language. They use phrases like to fall flat on his face or a man after his heart. And one of the problems with the King James Bible at the beginning was because of those phrases coming directly from the Greek, the English, they sounded weird to the English ear. Sound familiar to us now, we've heard them all our lives. But back then it was unfamiliar. The other thing is that the King James Bible, even in 1611 when it was published, all the these, thys, and thous, those were already starting to go out of the language. The language that the people were speaking, they were already starting to use you and mine instead of thine, and all that kind of stuff. So even at the time that the King James Version was published, it was already considered, the language was outdated. Another weird thing that it did was that it used his instead of the neutral preposition is. So where it says, ye are salt of the earth, but if salt hath lost his savor, rather than if salt has lost its savor. So it's a literal translation, but the language is out of date, and then the third thing about it is that it levels everything. In your home Bibles, whether you've got an RSV or an NRSV or a Good News Bible or a Message Bible or whatever version, the NIV, whatever version of the Bible you have at home, when you get to the Psalms, you'll see the Psalms arranged more like poetry. In the King James Version, all the poetry ends up looking like everything else. The poetry gets leveled. So, what the King James Bible did was it came up with a book that could be printed, placed in the hands of the people, and was an excellent translation. Language was a little old-fashioned, but because they read it to one another, they also listened for poetry in the words. So that in some of the other translations, when they heard phrases like, they shall break their swords also into mattocks and their spears to make sides, and one people shall not lift up a weapon against another, the King James scholar said, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. It just flows off the tongue and into the ear. Unfortunately, the Bible that was supposed to unite King James's nation did not unite it. There was a big war after that. His son gets killed. but ultimately it does become the Bible that is adopted by everybody in the land. So even after 400 some odd years, the King James Version of the Bible is still the number one version of the Bible that is sold in the world. It's the number one book sold in the world. And every time I go to be with somebody when they're sick or in hospital and I ask them what their favorite verse is, the verse they mention is Psalm 23. And they're not talking about the NRS version of Psalm 23. They want the King James Version. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul. That's the version that people want to hear when they are in pain and when they're struggling. I'm a big BBC fan, and I don't know if anybody in here ever watches the show or has watched the show Keeping Up Appearances with Patricia Routledge. And she's this kind of fussy English lady who's always worrying about staying abreast of whatever's going on with the neighbors. And so she has this very, very British sounding schoolmarm, rather sounding voice. And she was talking one time, and she mentioned the lyricism, the musicality of the King James Version. And she said in that amazing voice of hers, she said, great cadences. There's music there, you know. And for many of us, it's the King James Version of the Bible that still sounds like the voice of God. Happy Reformation Sunday.